Okay, this lesson is about the topic systemic racism. What do we mean by systemic racism? Using language as we do as an apologetic and outreach ministry, language-based. The ending here, it refers to anything of or pertaining to, in this case, a system. So it's racism that is systemic. I remind you of the statistical facts in problems, let's say, in organizations. Well, I need this here. I'll be reading about the Southern Baptist for a moment. But Dr. Edward Demings, the leader in transforming manufacturing and improving processes and removing variances and things like that, stated that 94% of all problems, that is statistically speaking, are systemic, that is of or pertaining to the system. Well, in this case, systemic racism, we have cultural, individual, institutional, internalized, and externalized. The internalized, where it literally becomes part of your being, and I'll help you out here, quoting from the 2007 Comprehensive Multicultural Education Textbook, Theory and Practice, 6th edition by Christine Bennett. And it says, yet another result of our deformed history is the internalized racism exhibited by individuals who internalize or hold within their psyche society's negative stereotypes about a group they identify with. They often experience stereotype threat. That is, they project from within themselves, it's called empathic projection, onto another person according to the stereotype that has been installed in them. We know this in the Proverbs, where it says that we shouldn't be so naive as to think that just because someone is sitting with us that they're for us, because the Bible said in Revelation, gave us insight that as a man thinks in his heart, that's how he is. So an internalized racism could be of an individual and promoted, and that is, it could be installed into an individual through an institution, even schools and churches, for example. Now, once it's internalized, that results in the externalized, which we call that discriminatory actions. That's behavior. Now, remarkable that as late as 2018, only 2018, my goodness, how late was that? It says here the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, came into being in 1845 as the Church of Southern Slaveholders. Notice Northern Baptist and Southern Baptist. That was within 15 years the North and South Civil War began. Notice that. How instrumental the Baptist churches were in what we call the Civil War. Now he goes on to say that 173 years later, this is Dr. Albert Mohler apparently having a lecture or something. He says that it's a flagship, well, it's a 71-page report. You can look that up online. And he said the founding fathers of this school, he's speaking of the seminary, all four of them were deeply involved in slavery and deeply complicit in the defense of slavery, writes school president Albert Mohler. Many of their successors on this faculty throughout the period of Reconstruction and well into the 20th century. Well, my goodness, he's speaking in 2018. How late in history is that? And he says that well into the 20th century, advocated the inferiority of African Americans and openly embraced the ideology of the lost cause of Southern slavery. Now, notice when we talk about there was an effort to justify the treatment of the African slave and later of the Afro-American citizen, white society encouraged an army of propagandists to scientifically prove the inferiority of black people. People went on and did that theologically as well. So when we talk about systemic racism and we talk about what does that mean, again, our church here, Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, didn't begin in Jacksonville, wasn't organized until 1950. As late as just a decade later, well, yeah, within 15 years later, notice here, within 15 years we have a Civil War. Within 15 years after Landmark was established here in Jacksonville, we have a legislative action in place by missionary Baptist churches and the civil rights and segregation issue, 1954 to 64. Now, everyone in the United States is against forced integration. That is, no one's about, for example, my family, and pointing to my grandmother who was born on a concentration camp in Oklahoma. And yes, you can find in the multicultural textbook when they finally called reservations, here it is, Oklahoma, already the home of 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, was soon to become a vast concentration camp. And I've often quick-wittedly would tell people, well, she was born on a concentration camp, and I said, I'm often asked, what's the difference between a reservation and a concentration camp? I say, well, which side of the fence you're on? And it kind of breaks the distress of the thought that someone as late as my senior year in high school was still alive, who was born in 1906, and the last survivor died in 1932. That is the last survivor of the actual Trail of Tears. But, you know, I can don this costume and put this head feathers on, and I can go get my little shirt over there, Cherokee Nation, the logo of the Tahlequah Nation, or the area Tahlequah, which is the capital of the Cherokee Nation. Which, isn't that ironic? That'd be like saying Auschwitz was the capital of Israel, you know, the concentration camp. So it's ugly when we think about it. But this is a systemic reality that, as now we have the issues going on as late as 1954 and 64, I began pastoring here in 1999, and that same year I baptized someone, that is, our church did, but I was standing there and baptized someone who did not meet the criteria that I couldn't have supposed it was still there. I had no idea that someone could be opposed to someone being baptized, especially living in a military community, Jacksonville, Arkansas. Never in any way that I was aware. But you got to remember, I was out of church for years. Now that's nothing to say good. So my idea of our community was from the military, it was from our schools, it was from my own interaction in the community. So I would have only projected onto Landmark as any other church in Jacksonville. I was just as naive about a black church, which I wouldn't have believed there was a black church, for example, that someone wouldn't attend it because they weren't black, any more than I would have thought there was a white church where someone wouldn't attend because they weren't white. That was, especially that late in history. But then to read that as late as 2018, Dr. Albert Mohler, he led the seminary since 1993, and he said, we've been guilty of a sinful absence of historical curiosity. So I don't know what that means, but in an academic environment, I guess you have to find a nice way of saying we just never cared. So he said, we knew and we could not fail to know that slavery and deep racism were in the story. Well, the story is now told in a way only Southern Baptists themselves could tell it. The report draws heavily on seminary archives, including correspondence among the four founders. Now, you can look this stuff up. It's not hidden anywhere. It's just, and for example, there's a book entitled Social Ethics Among Southern Baptists, 1917 to 1969 by George D. Kelsey, ATL, well, it's the Scarecrow Press, Incorporated, American Theological Library Association, 1973. Now, it has all the good, the bad, and the ugly in it if you want to know about what took place. What's striking, though, is to notice the relationship of the Southern Baptist, Northern Baptist, North and South War, and to notice that even though the war ended, the system was still in play. For me in 1999 to be confronted and somewhat emoted, someone was very emotional. Now, it didn't really bother me. I just couldn't imagine what the poor soul was thinking, the young man we baptized, had it ever was brought back to his attention that someone was so upset about it. Now, that was just a bridge to cross for me, because I'd already crossed it years before, and we had already been doing outreach for quite some time. I had been here over 5 years as Minister of Education Outreach. So reaching people, going into the community was just normal. Did it when I was 8 and 10 years old through a Southern Baptist church. If you can believe, we called it that, Southern Baptist. We didn't even know what we were saying. So here I was out in the streets going to every neighborhood, not knowing that the system was already in place, institutionally speaking. Our schools are not, so our schools weren't part of that. But that churches. So if you want to understand what systemic racism, and 94% of the problem is the system, and you want to notice how recent in history, where 1845 that began, and 100 years later there's still legislative actions being submitted appealing. Now the war was over, but the system was still in place. And when I learned our own history here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church here in this community, which is, I share it openly with anybody, it's all behind us now, but even our bus ministry had been banned from approaching the United States military base because a bus went onto the base to happily pick up children, but when the bus approached and arrived at our building, then the driver was instructed to place a certain child back on the bus and return them home. Now, if you are aware of who that was, or that child, or if you're that young child and you're now an adult now, and if you remember that and you hear about this, contact me. I would love to interview you. I would love to know what that was like as a child. I don't know how you'd have processed it, where you embark a bus just like you would if you were going to school, and you get on the bus and the kids are different just like you are, and we're all different, you know, and here's tall, short, fat, skinny, scrawny, burly, bullies, cowards, chickens, whatever we called each other. And then here we are with our different colors and our different social status, but we're all on the same bus. I remember getting on a school bus. We would get up early in the morning just to ride a bus to go to another route before it even came back to where it would pass our area to pick us up, just so we could be on the bus longer. Now you'd have to know there wasn't much to do back then. There was no cell phone. There was a couple of channels, but you had to stand up, walk over, and change them. There was no such thing as Nintendo. So to rise early to catch a bus that was not even the time to be picked up was just, but to think that child would get on a bus thinking, wow, we're going to a church, and then to find out that they were told to return to the bus, be on that bus by themselves, and be delivered back, and never really be able to overcome that. I don't know how a person, well, people aren't made to overcome it. That's part of the system. The system will break you. You cannot win, because once people internalize this, they then act on it. So you can read about these types of things. And like I said, I shouldn't have been the first person to baptize someone in 1999. That wasn't possible, except for the systemic reality of whatever supported that and assured that. Our seminary back in as long ago as the 70s had already begun to reflect their community, reflect diversity in the student body, to assure that everyone had opportunities, especially knowing that we were training that they were training pastors. Dr. John Penn tells me the history. You should hear about it, how those men were burdened to assure that people were taught and trained to be pastors, to be able to teach the Bible. So they just stepped right over the problem and continued to go forward, advancing the kingdom of God, training men. So the seminary was decades ahead. That's why when I learned about what the Southern Baptists were saying, I was struck. It was only 2 years ago. And then in 2007, Landmark Missionary Baptist Church went way out of our way to announce to our community through the paper that we were deliberately diverse, intentionally integrated, meaning we had broken down some systemic things. In 2003, we sold our original plant location to a church called St. Mark, which was mostly black congregational members, and that was even pushed back by people in the community and former ones of this church, who seemed to have knowledge of how many churches, black churches, quote, we should have in Jacksonville, and they seemed to think we had enough. Now, I don't know how they would know that, but that's just one of those silly things. But remember, when you've internalized this error, you'll externalize it in behavior. When institutions, even churches, are used, now what were churches doing achieving segregation or forcing integration? Either way, we read about the atrocities of the indigenous people, forced integration. Well, what were, quote, the religious people doing? Presuming that, for me, a heathen, an original person here from those people, that we needed our hair cut off, we needed our totem poles chopped down, and we needed to be, through the institution of public schools, socialized and made to look like, I guess, it's called, they would colonize more rather than evangelize. And evangelism, even overseas to this day, is the biggest challenge. Is people go in and think that they've done something when they take a native person and make them look like whatever they are, which that's all part of it. But when you hear about systemic racism, that's why if you can tune out the violence, which is not about the racism. It's really, there's no rationale for hurting people. There are whites hurting people on the streets. There are blacks on the streets hurting people. So if you can just tune that out for a minute, because regrettably, when that type of thing happens, focus on the system is lost, and people who must live under that system have to return to it. So I was never really penalized. I mean, I never cared about what people could or would say about me, because I would baptize somebody. At Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, we baptize people who believe the gospel. We preach the gospel to every creature. That would be a red one, a brown one, a yellow one, a black one, even a white one. We'll even preach to Republicans. So we don't really have any bounds when it comes to preaching the gospel. Anyone who hears that message and trusts Jesus for everlasting life, we gladly baptize them. So that's really nothing we would ever push against. So like I said, when we sold our building, it had appraised for a certain value. We sold it at almost over 40% less than the market value to help as a partner co-plant St. Mark here in Jacksonville. And that wasn't without pushback, and it wasn't without controversy. But really, that's not anything, because I had never internalized, so I couldn't externalize in my behavior. I couldn't by being primed racism, because I attended Missionary Baptist Seminary. It wasn't possible. By the time I attended the Missionary Baptist Seminary, my first time there in 1987, there was no such thing there in the curriculum, in the faculty, on the staffing. There's no concept. And like I tell people, my name's Tree, don't cut me down. But there's really, it's a little funny, because in Jacksonville, they'll ask me for a military discount. And yes, I'm digressing again. And I'll say, no, my side lost. Well, often they become tickled by that when I tell them I'm a Cherokee, and they give me the discount anyway, because I said, well, you might as well, it's arbitrary, just hit the button. So they do, and I get the discount, and I have a chance to talk. But unless you recognize the cultural realities and what occurs through a cultural approach, an individual approach, and the means and mechanism of institutions that can be deployed and used to assure that this is internalized by individuals and internalized by culture, then you'll never appreciate that this can then be, because it was internalized by individuals and by culture through institutions, then it goes out in actions and behaviors. So if you don't understand systemic racism, then for example, here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, how I was trained in any organization to approach a system, a problem that was systemic, is you improve the system. So for example, Landmark, since July 1999, no one's been refused baptism. No one's been refused the gospel. We have structured programs, which in those programs, we reach into every area of our community across every demographic, socially, racially, culturally, creedally, financially, and through, for example, the Cornet sports, where we have in the fall football, basketball in the winter, soccer in the spring. We have Cornet clubs, and we have core neighborhoods, and those three initiatives, led by three different pastors entirely, they're out there with everyone. They're out in the field, and the field is our community, very diverse and integrated and multicultural, and so our congregation reflects that. So there is no systemic racism that would then be, through this institution of our church, used for an individual to be internalized, and then our culture of our church become internalized that, and then it be expressed. For example, we would never have a bus ministry where someone was told they can get on the bus, but they can't get off the bus if they plan on attending our church. That would never happen. We'd never have someone come forward saying, I trust Jesus for my everlasting life, but then we refuse them baptism. None of that exists in the kingdom of God. None of it exists in churches. It's just quite remarkable that when people don't think about what were the Baptists doing when they presumed to form a convention, for example. Well, we'd like to admire the convention, its cooperative system and whatever. I'm sure they've come a long way, but that machine was built to achieve something now that the consequences of it, eventually negative externality, led to a North and South war. And when the war is over, the system that was set in place through this right here still is in play, with collateral, that is negative externalities, still being played out. Because you couldn't have told me that in 1999, when I'm standing there baptizing someone, that there would be someone summons me to their home to explain to me and take issue with what I'd done. I would have said, I would have thought someone had a camera on me and were trying to do one of those prank or punk me TV show things. I would not have, my brain couldn't process, because I'd never internalized that. And that doesn't make me better. It just makes me more educated, more aware of it. Now, if you really want to read something good, get your comprehensive multicultural education book. Get your book about the bias in history and read about it. Because if you have a problem with systemic racism, then improve the system. Not the racism, not the racist system, but improve a system. Say, I would like to see churches not force integration, but not be used to instigate segregation, support it, and then even be involved in a great way in leading to the Civil War in the United States of America. And then you certainly don't want a war to be over and yet systems still be in place operating to continue to internalize individuals, and then by that cause an entire culture of individuals, a Southern culture, if you will. And you certainly don't want to use schools and churches. I mean, we have a history in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas, with integration of the school. So that was an institution that was being used to internalize racism into individuals and to support a culture that would be the one using the institution. Isn't it strange how all this is related? So if you have a culture of racism, it will take its schools and churches and use it for individuals to be internalized to support the culture. So then it can be externalized, and that's called discrimination. So, and one thing I'd just like to say is that I can talk about, I can take off my head feathers, I can take off my little Native American t-shirt, and I can take a break from the cause, if you will. But one thing I noticed about people who are very distinct in their nationality, for example, we have Hispanics, we have Filipinos, we have African Americans, and or Black Americans, whatever way someone wishes to describe themselves. But how do you take that off? I mean, people, someone had written a nice article from the viewpoint of being black in America, and one thing I noticed that they did not say, but they had described it, is, you know, there was no sector in their community or in their culture, in their society, where they could just turn that off for a while. I mean, it's not like they can say, hey, hon, go get the kids and let's go take a travel for a while. Because while they're traveling, they stop somewhere, they've got to deal with this restaurant. Or they travel somewhere and they stay and go into an area for a park or what do you call it, an amusement park, a theme park or something. Well, now you got to deal with that. So everywhere you go, they just can't turn it off. And I kept thinking how interesting it was. I can just leave this silly thing hanging here and treat it like a Halloween costume, and I can take off my shirt that says Cherokee Nation and talk about the Tahlequah, and I can talk about concentration camp. I mean, it's an interesting conversation, but I get a break from it. It's like when I came to church here, and I came here for my own interest, which was a young lady who grew up here. But my point is when people brought me things that were not part of my psyche and part of my being, it never conveyed, because I'd never been primed and trained and taught. That's why I say it's so difficult even for religious people today to say, why can't we make him fall into one of our camps, such as Calvin's ism or Mohler's ism or Arminian's ism or Martin Luther's Lutheranism or whatever else is out there. It's just not possible for someone who just studies, for example, as we do here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, the Bible, and as someone who understands the life of Christ, who came and called people out from a system of oppression. And if you don't know the story of Egypt in the Old Testament, you don't know the story of people in the life of Christ when he came. And he said he came to call sinners, not the righteous. There was a caste system there. There were people who had been oppressed and relegated to a lower class and were treated as inferior ones. And Jesus said, I didn't even come to call you superior ones. I came to call the inferior ones in spirit, that poor one, impoverished ones, inferior ones. And who did that? Who was persecuting people? And look at all the atrocities throughout history. And now, as late as 2018, Dr. Al Mohler is standing up talking about the Southern Baptist Convention and how it is the church, quote, as the review said, the church of Southern slaveholders. Well, goodness, that would have been a good thing to have stopped maybe in 1999, or as we did to deliberately go out into our community and in our paper in 2007. And as I unashamedly and without reservation still don't get who would presume the right to say what we as a church are called to do and commissioned by Jesus Christ to go out and preach the gospel, and those who believe it, we baptize them. And those who then want to fellowship into that gospel, fellowship into that gospel. Then those who are fellowshipped into the gospel and are enter a fellowship that's into the gospel, then we teach them how to self-examine, self-correct, and eat the Lord's Supper. And we teach them how the church, Christ and the church, reflects the marriages we should have. And that we could point to that and see that. And that children can see their parents in an assembly like this that reflects the community, that glorifies God and extends the grace of God to everyone. So it's really complicated, and I hate it for people who are battling the system rather than aware of it. But I hope this helps you to understand that once an institution is used to internalize, if you will, radicalize, indoctrinate an individual, that's because there was first a culture that would then use the institution to internalize the individual, and then that was all so that the externalized, the implementation or deployment of discrimination practices could be sustained and deliberately carried out. So here at Landmark Baptist Church, I'm thankful that this is all behind us, thankful that we're discipled here. We make disciples. We are aware of ourselves. Every month we eat the Lord's Supper. We call upon the Lord to search us, try us, find in us whatever He first and foremost would know. We don't want to kid ourselves. We don't want to pretend to be hypocrites to ourselves, deceive ourselves. It's very humiliating to go through that process, but we do it every month. We hold fast our profession of faith that was conferred upon us in baptism, that is, bearing the testimony of Christ. We remember the commission by our great commissioner to go out to all the nations, all the peoples, all the ways by which people are differentiated and distinguished. So it's a large matter. So if you're not aware of it, but this is a little bit about history of Baptists. I'll include this article in the description, and then, like I said, this is just 100 years after a war ends, the system that was established because of it, such as a convention, which, you know, if they stop calling themselves Southern Baptist, that'd be great, but that'd take another generation or two just to stop that. And then to know the relationship of North and South Baptist with North and South Civil War, and to notice that we still have the internalized being externalized and institutions being used to internalize individuals and support that culture. So you have a blessed day. This is heavy. It can be discouraging. It can be distressful. It might seem insurmountable, but happy to say that we made the improvements in the system by deconstructing the system, taking down the barriers, the hurdles that people would have to cross that we didn't have to cross. Jesus, as we were always taught, the ground was level at the foot of the cross. There's no high or low. There's no hurdles or hoops you have to jump through or cross over. So we take Jesus to the people. We go to the streets with Him. We invite people to come to Christ Jesus. Now that's any color, that's from any creed, any theistic tradition or order, whatever condition you're in. We preach Jesus Christ, and we implore you, and even against the culture, the cultural norms, against the institutional machinery, if you will, that's in place there, even against that which has been internalized by people and then outwardly externalized. And we approach individuals, even in an adversarial culture, a black versus white, a right versus left, a north versus south, which any way you want to say it, it's the same conflict. And Christ came And he said he didn't come to condemn this world, but rather this world, right or left side of it, the north or southern borders of it, or the black and white within it can be saved. So you have a blessed day, and hope this helps you understand what is systemic racism.